Hello, this is Chuck Stull with an overview of the oil industry. Oil is another large, important industry, but with a very different structure than agriculture and with different concerns. If we look at some of the market conditions, we will see there are some parallels. Demand for oil is very inelastic in the short run. For instance, most drivers are locked into a commute even if the price of gasoline goes up. Industrial users still need to heat, process, or transport their goods. So there's very little flexibility in the short run. In the longer run, change is possible. Commuters could buy a more efficient car, they could find a new job, or move their residence to shorten their commute. Similarly, industrial users could switch to other fuels. But demand does change with very important ways with income. With higher incomes, people have a higher demand for oil. We can look at this either on a macroeconomic level, where we look at very poor countries where most transportation would be by walking, and then as income slowly increases, people will increase the kinds of transportation needs they have. So going from walking to a scooter to a motorcycle to a car to two cars and so forth. So as national income goes up, people do use more oil. We can also look at this in the short run, looking at economic fluctuation. And when we have a recession, there is a decrease in demand for oil. Looking to the supply side, supply is also fairly inelastic in the short run. In oil production, most costs are sunk, and most plants operate at capacity. So if prices go up substantially, there is very little increase in quantity supplied, at least in the short run. Now, in the longer run, if prices are high, firms can develop new sources. There will be entry into the oil fields. Or if prices are low, some of the facilities will shut down in response to long-term price changes. If we look at supply over the long run, supply has changed substantially over time. The overwhelming impact on oil has been new discoveries. So if we look at the United States, originally oil was found in western Pennsylvania, then major oil finds in Texas, followed by major oil finds overseas in the Mideast, and then northern oil in Alaska, in the North Sea, and offshore oil in many countries. So new discoveries have been very, very important. At the same time, we do want to recognize that oil is a non-renewable resource and that the old sources get depleted. We don't see a major oil production back in western Pennsylvania, for instance. And so the supply can either increase or decrease as we find new oil or use up existing sources. If we look at oil prices, in the short run, they display a lot of volatility. For the same reason that agriculture markets display a lot of volatility. We have inflexible consumers, inflexible producers, so a small decrease in supply leads to a big increase in price, or a small increase in demand leads to a big change in price. And vice versa. If there's a small increase in supply, prices fall dramatically. And if there is a small decrease in demand, prices fall a lot. So if you look at the graph, you can see a really big drop in the price of oil associated with the financial crisis and the following recession. If we look at current prices, oil prices are very low, perhaps near record lows, adjusting for inflation, and that has to do with a big reduction in demand due to the stay-at-home orders and the slowing of the economy worldwide. And at the same time, OPEC has been unable to reach an agreement on supply, so supply has remained high, again, in the short run. Let me turn to the vertical chain of production for oil. So crude oil production starts with exploration and extraction, and then it is transported to refineries. Refineries produce a variety of products. Gasoline is the one that most consumers are most familiar with, but also diesel, fuel oil, asphalt, and tars, and it makes feedstocks from oil for the plastic industry and for the chemical industry. After being refined, it's again transported where it is marketed. If we look at gasoline, often it will go through wholesale jobbers and then through gasoline retailing. The transportation is very important. Transportation of oil is global. We have pipelines, we have tankers, we have barges, and we have trucks. Um, and so these are all important ways that oil and petroleum products are moved from place to place. Each of these vertical stages of production have different issues and in some cases different market structures, so we will return and look at some of these separately. But unlike agriculture, oil displays a large amount of vertical integration. The oil majors are big, vertically integrated, multinational petroleum companies. At one time, these were known as the Seven Sisters. Now they're sometimes called super majors or simply majors. There aren't seven anymore because of a lot of mergers and corporate changes that took place. So the big oil often refers to ExxonMobil, Chevron, which owns Texaco, Shell, British Petroleum, and Total. These companies all explore, drill, pump, ship, refine, distribute, and retail petroleum products, and they control a substantial part of the entire industry. At the peak of their influence, these oil majors controlled over 80% of the market. The oil majors have been multinationals since at least the late 1800s, getting active in Russia and Sumatra, in Persia in 1908. And so we've had an interesting dynamics of global competition and cooperation to develop oil fields around the world. To look at a specific example of international cooperation or cooperation internationally amongst these oil majors, in 1928, Exxon, Chevron, Texaco, and Mobil formed a joint venture known as Aramco, the Arab American Oil Company. And this was a cooperative development to exploit Saudi Arabian oil. Now, if this were a domestic concern, antitrust challenges would be raised by this, because we have a tight oligopoly and we see cooperation amongst them. But in this the case of the oil industry, Western governments encouraged cooperation to exploit and develop foreign oil fields. So while we had a lot of vertical integration, we also see these elements of partial horizontal integration, where several companies are working together in a joint venture. There were similar joint ventures by major Western oil companies to develop the oil fields in Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran. Many of the oil majors are active in other energy production. They may be major producers of natural gas. And so we do see there are some economies of scope in these energy industries. Now, there are some smaller oil producers. These would be the independents. These are often not vertically integrated. They might specialize in just exploration, just refining, or just retailing, or some of them may be partially vertically integrated. So companies like Occidental, Valero, Citgo, or Tesoro would be considered independents. Now, these can be very large companies, but they are small relative to the oil majors. Let me look just a little more at the middle of the vertical chain of production at the oil refining. Crude oil is processed into various final products, and it is basically through a distillation process where the crude oil is heated up and then distilled and separated into light, intermediate, and heavy fractions. So the light fractions typically are about 16 to 24% of the total volume. And so those would be things like gasoline, propane, naphtha. Intermediate would be kerosene, which can be used for jet fuel, heating oil, and then the heavy pieces would be the tar and asphalts and waxes. Now, depending on the location where the crude oil comes from, you may get different proportions. There was a major innovation in the 20th century called cracking, which breaks heavy fractions of oil into lighter ones, essentially trying to produce more gasoline. Essentially, that led to a doubling in terms of the amount of gasoline that can be produced from a barrel of crude oil. Now, the refining industry does display economies of scale. Refineries have substantial dimensional economies. And again, let me remind you, the volume grows faster than the surface area, so there is a savings for bigger production facilities. And so the pipes to transport the oil, the distillation towers and the cracking towers, all have dimensional economies. Bigger is lower cost. So in general, large refineries are more efficient. They have lower cost than small refineries. Pipelines also have major dimensional economies. Between any two given points, it's cheaper to have a single big pipeline than two smaller ones. Pipelines might be considered a natural monopoly. It's better to have one than to have more than one, looking at the cost of production. Now, besides pipelines, in coastal cities, tankers can compete where port facilities exist. Now, there are distribution costs transporting the refined product to market that do limit the ability of some manufacturers, some refiners, to take full advantage of the economies of scale. So if we look at the United States, there are regions that are somewhat separated simply because the pipelines and distribution networks are not the same. So the general pipelines would be the East Coast, the South, the Midwest, the Mountain States, the Gulf Coast, and the West Coast. And you can see substantial differences in the price of oil across these regions, right? Sometimes being, up to $1 more, or 30 to 40% more per gallon. So the markets are separated geographically, and there are some state laws that require some states that require by law reformulated gas for air pollution control, which means that we can't always see separation, or can't see transportation, keeping these markets somewhat separate. If you look at those prices from a year ago, you'll notice that they're substantially higher than prices today. Prices have dropped nearly $1 a gallon in nearly every one of these markets, and that again is reflecting the impact of the COVID-19 virus and the stay-at-home orders and the reduced economic activity. There is another factor that's important in explaining price differences across regions and across states, and that has to do with gasoline taxes. Gasoline is a heavily taxed commodity, and partly that's used to support roads through user fees. Instead of paying tolls on everything, we simply pay a price per gallon. So if we look at Michigan, we can see that we're just above the average at 56 cents a gallon taxes. which is substantially less than California or uh, Washington and some other states. But you will also see that there are some states, particularly in the Gulf area, that have very low taxes. And so we have noticeable difference in prices across states, not just due to the structure of the industry, but also due to the structure of the taxes. Thank you. This is Chuck Stull from Kalamazoo College.